Hi everyone, thank you for welcoming me today. This next part of the series is on monasticism. It's a big word, and on the screen you see a man dressed in black. Nowadays we'd call him a monk. And behind him is the St. Anthony's Monastery in Egypt, which still looks like that today. So we're going to talk about that and what these people called monks and nuns do today, and why that's like a really, really strong and great treasure the Coptic Church has to offer us. So monks, when we say monks, we refer to men. When we say nuns, we refer to females. Monks typically reside in monasteries and nuns reside in convents. It's all the same, but just so that we differentiate here. It's a way of life where they've decided that they're going to live a life completely dedicated and consecrated to God. They're typically actually always not married, and they tend to live in a place that's secluded from the world. In Egypt, that tends to be a desert. It doesn't have to be. It's just somewhere that's typically not habitable by humans. And we're going to go through their day-to-day life. If you haven't been to a monastery, it's going to sound shocking. Even if you've been, it's still shocking. But they commit their lives there, and there's no turning back. Like once you become a nun, you become a monk. You don't just decide 10 years later that I've had enough, this was a great spiritual retreat, it's time to go back to the world. They stay in this complex almost, not just a single church, a complex of maybe one or two, three, couple of churches, a kitchen area, a garden, everything you need to live, and they stay there. And we're going to talk about why they do that and why the Coptic Church especially is famous for that. So I'm going to start with this story. The first time I visited a monastery was around 10 years ago when I was in 9th grade. And I kind of got forced into going to this trip by my dad. But it was in Texas. It was called the St. Mary and St. Moses Monastery in Texas in the States. And we got there at night, so we just went straight to sleep. And it was dark. I heard a bunch of crickets and animals. We were literally in the desert, but I was like, okay, I'm excited for the morning. Let's see, what one does here in a monastery. I was surprised to be awoken at approximately 3:45 a.m., like with knocking on our door by the head volunteer servant there. And I was really confused. Like I didn't know why we were starting so early. And like you can't peacefully wake someone up at 4 a.m. So I was really upset already. We got dressed like at 4 in the morning and went outside, and it was still dark out. We were walking towards the church. It's about like a 100-meter walk. And I remember seeing a bunch of guys who looked like this, maybe 10 or 20 of them walking towards the church in silence. And this immediately, like to my eyes as a 9th grader, just looked to me like, I don't know, some cult, some ritual, something that was routine, that's for sure. Because all they did is ring a giant bell in the monastery. They don't have phones or they don't use them for alarms. They just hear a bell and they wake up and they're heading to church. Now what do they do at church at 4 in the morning? They do something called midnight praises every day, literally every day. I believe we do that here on Saturday nights at a more reasonable time of 8, maybe 9 p.m. to 11. But they do it from 4 to 6 in the morning, usually typically followed by liturgy, or maybe there's a break and then liturgy afterwards. I remember what touched me most about this trip wasn't the midnight praises. I was really confused, to be honest, like trying not to fall asleep in the church. But what really touched me and what brought me back to the monastery constantly for spiritual retreats, and they accept us to come stay for a couple days, weeks at a time, was simply observing their way of life. For the first time in my life, I saw a group of people, not just one scattered abroad here, a group of people who took their faith so seriously that they were willing to wake up at 4 a.m., do a whole host of other things that I learned on that trip. And so I saw a group of people who took God seriously, who took their faith like it wasn't a joke. Like it wasn't just, forgive me, it wasn't just Sunday school, it wasn't just a Sunday morning thing. These people were living, literally, dressed up, living for God. I remember that really touched me. And let's explore why monasticism specifically is a great treasure for all of us, and why the Coptic Church particularly has a great stake in this. When I was preparing for this, I looked towards my bookshelf. It's not that, I don't have that many books, but I usually look there when I want to find inspiration for what to talk about. And I was like, oh, let me find like one book written by a monk or, something about monasticism. And I realized that the entire top shelf, which is all my favorite books, were almost all written by monks, whether present time or in the past. And I looked down and down, and at least half the shelf was written by monastics. And that's when I realized I'm not going to go to the bookshelf, there's too much to read. But I also realized that the desert is really rich. When I say desert, I mean monasteries that are present in the desert. Because it's secluded from the world. So I believe there are other monasteries and other cultures and ethnicities like Germans. You can find them in the forests. You can find people in the past living on boats, different places. But I realized the desert was really, really rich. And for Egyptians, it really is a desert. Now, what makes the desert so rich? There is this Coptic, I guess we call him a Coptologist. He's a German. He actually takes great interest. He passed away a few years ago, but he takes great interest in researching the Coptic Orthodox Church. He spent his whole life talking about Coptic history. He wrote a book called 2,000 Years of Coptic Christianity. And in this book, one of the sentences that stood out was this on the screen. The outstanding contribution of the Egyptian church to world Christianity was the monastic movement. The Egyptian church, in other words, Coptic church, and monastic movement is kind of this movement towards beginning to live in monasteries and convents. As we know and we learn, Jesus didn't institute a physical building called a church, and he certainly didn't institute a physical location called a monastery. That came about through the legacy of believers who came after Jesus. But this is someone who's not even Egyptian, not even Coptic, who studied all world religions, particularly Coptic Christianity, and said that the greatest contribution that we had to the world was the monastic movement. And the Egyptian desert is famous to this day. So last year I visited Egypt, first time in a really long time, and I stayed a week in the SMSK monastery. And there was with us someone who looked like a monk, but he wasn't Egyptian. He was staying in the retreat house with us, with typically a bunch of guys like me. Honestly, a bunch of hooligans just going for vacation. And he looked really serious, and he was just doing the whole monk thing. And so after a few days, we asked him, what are you doing here? And he said he was a Catholic bishop. And he was staying before and after us, longer than a week. And so we asked him, why are you staying here? And he said, Monasticism started here, and he believed that this monastery, St. Michael's Monastery, is most true to the original monasticism 1,500 years ago. So he's there to learn. He was in his 70s. He was there to learn from the monks. And honestly, that made me really proud. It's like wow, the Catholic bishop is coming to our monastery and telling us that he really thinks it's amazing. Now, the Coptic Church, nowadays, we don't see the influences that come from the monastery on our day-to-day church life, but there are a lot, and Father John was telling me a few of them, and I'll just share a few. That spirit of discipleship that we have in the Coptic Church is very unique. The fact that I can sit with Father John for 20, 30 minutes, sometimes an hour, about my problem, or just in confession, is extremely unique to the Coptic Church. Now, some churches are shocked that you spend more than 2-3 minutes in confession. It's like, well, what are you talking about? How does he have time for you? How much do you pay him? This is something very, very unique. The pastoral care that we have in the Coptic Church, the one-on-one intimate connection that one can build with the priests, the leaders of the church, is extremely unique, and it actually emerged from the desert, not the early church. The early church, most people were illiterate, meaning they didn't read, they didn't write. They were under mass persecution, so it's not like they could freely gather. The average Christian would head to church for a little bit, listen to something, maybe if he heard it, because there's no microphones, and then go try to practice it in real life and live with a very short lifespan because of the persecution going around. So there wasn't a lot of one-on-one intimate personal connection, and that emerged in the desert, because very commonly you would find monks gathering around an elder monk, sitting on the floor and asking him, Abba, give me a word, give me something that I can chew on, give me something that can change the way I live. And this continued until now. Our Coptic Pope currently, all our Coptic bishops are monks. And that's how the monastery breeds our Coptic liturgy. Asceticism in the Coptic Church is also heavily influenced, of course, by the desert. Fasting, obedience, discipleship, the canonical prayers that we have. And the whole tradition of the anchorites and spirit-born began in the monastery. It's not exclusive to the monastery now, but began there as well. So how did monasticism start? I gave you a little bit of an introduction. How did it start, and where did it emerge from in the early church? Like we said, Jesus didn't institute the monastery. It came about from one person particularly, and then a group of people who thought, I want to offer something to Jesus. Because like we heard last week, it actually started with the martyrs. Martyrs is from a Greek word that means to witness. And these people would literally offer their lives to Christ. They would shed their blood for Jesus. It's documented that like thousands, if not millions, of Christians would offer their lives to the Lord under mass persecution in the Roman Empire in the first 2 or 3 centuries of Christianity. And martyria literally means to witness. So they were witnessing for God. They were on fire for Jesus. They really, really wanted to offer their lives to God. But this stopped at a certain point. By the grace of God, there was a righteous emperor named King Constantine, and he took reign in 313 AD, so the early 4th century. He was a Christian emperor, so he passed an edict that abolished the notion of persecution against Christians. It was now a legal religion. But now you had a group of people who were really used to, or really, growing up excited to offer themselves to God, not fearing death even. So a lot of people who are thinking, wow, now that mass persecution has ended, how can I offer myself to God? And this intense longing to be a witness is actually what led to monasticism. We see a lot of parallels in monasticism to the martyrs. I mean, a lot of our monastic saints, even St. Moses the Strong, who the church is named after, was a martyr at the end of his life. St. Emiliana was a nun, and she went to a convent, but she was also martyred. So that it's in the same vein. It's in the same love for God. This leads us to a man named St. Anthony the Great. St. Anthony the Great is an extremely, extremely important character, not only to Coptic Christianity, but world history. In that he is regarded today as the first monk, the founder of monasticism. Like we said on the first slide, that monastery still exists in Egypt today. And the life of Anthony is written by one of the Coptic popes named St. Athanasius. It's a really small book, and it's really, really eloquently written and really, really inspiring if you get a chance to read. Like his life story, long story short, which we really can't summarize, but in the early 4th century, he enters a church. Now, he had been praying and longing to offer his life to God. This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision. He entered the church and heard the gospel. And the gospel said from Matthew 19:21, if you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me. So he quite literally, he was pretty rich growing up. He quite literally sold all his belongings and possessions, gave them to the poor. He eventually gave his sister to a group of women who eventually formed, I believe, a convent or something of the sort in the early stages, and he went to live by himself. And he was the first one who offered his life as a living sacrifice to God. So he couldn't die. He didn't end up dying for Jesus, but his whole life was a martyrdom for Jesus. His whole life was a sacrifice. He was the founder of monasticism, and he was the first one to introduce this concept of offering my life, my time, my energy, my thoughts, everything to Jesus. Everything for the sake of living an ascetic relationship with God. So for years, decades, he lived by himself in prayer. Over time, God was instructing him on how to construct his day-to-day life. You can't spend your whole day praying. God reminded him, you need to work. So he taught him to work as well. So the prayer was mixed with work. And through St. Anthony, many were attracted to the desert. So you have after St. Anthony, great saints like St. Macarius, St. Bishoy, St. Moses the Strong. You have St. Pachomius, who eventually transformed monasticism to be like groups of communities. Like we have today, people don't tend to live as hermits as much, still exists, but they are surrounded by a community of other monks where you can serve your brothers, serve your sisters in the convent. And in the late 4th century, beginning of the 5th century, there was an absolute explosion of monasticism. There were thousands and thousands of monks. It's written that if you would walk through the quiet, it's not so quiet anymore, desert, you would always, all night, hear praises to God. It was not an abandoned place. And this is where the monastic movement began. Until today, the Coptic Church is known as the church that founded monasticism. The desert started in Egypt, it emerged to Palestine, to Syria, and nowadays you have the Greek church, the Russian church, the Catholic church. Many churches have monasteries, and they all trace their roots back to the Egyptian desert where monasticism all started. This is a quick example. I thought it was a visual representation of what what a monastic martyr is, like what they're really trying to do by offering their lives to God, and what that means for me and you today, we'll talk about soon. There are saints called stylites, which is from the Greek style or stilo, I don't know how to say it, which are saints who eventually lived on a pillar, like a physical pillar. They just stood on top and stood there and prayed. Exposed to the elements, rain or shine, they stood outside, and they tended to be from Syria. So this was the first one. His name is Saint Simeon of the Stylites. He was inspired by Anthony and the Egyptian monks, and eventually he wanted to offer so much to God that he decided he is going to live on a pillar. And what I want to emphasize is the pillar was shaped like a square, like an altar. He was offering his life as a living sacrifice to God. He decided, I'm going to stand in the gap between heaven and earth and intercede for the people of the world. If no one will do it, so be it. I will be there, I will stand there, rain or shine. And he started a movement of monks who became, like in English, pillar saints. But it's just that spirit of wanting to offer one's life to God. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the day in the life of a monk or a nun, and how that can kind of influence our lives. When monks or nuns become ordained, they take 3 vows in their ordination process. The first one is obedience. There's a really high emphasis on being obedient to one's spiritual father or mother, obedient to the canons and laws of the church, and a vow of poverty, meaning they don't make money and spend money on themselves, on food, on clothes, or anything like that. And lastly, on chastity, as we said, they don't marry. And in the ordination process, I unfortunately never got to attend one, but I hope I get to one day. The monk at some points, or the nun at some point, lies down on the floor. It's a very unique ordination process. They lie down on the floor with their head facing, I believe, west, and their feet facing the east. And eventually they put a veil over them. Now that position is, if you've attended a funeral, the same position that one who has departed is placed when the funeral is prayed. Now they're lying on the ground, and there's a veil on top of them, symbolizing what? That they are now dead to the world, and they are now alive only to Christ. And that's the calling for all of us, and it's a very visual ordination, and it's really beautiful, because from now on this monk is crucified with Jesus. He no longer lives for himself, he lives to God. And Jesus loves monasticism because at its essence, it's an offering to God. It's an outward expression of consecration or being set apart for God, yes, but at its core, at its root, it's one's desire to grow in love for God, and it's a complete and no take-backs response to God, which is why I think it's really cool. You can't change your mind, you can't come back home. And it's what I noticed most in 9th grade was I saw monks who offered their time, because if you look at the schedule, it's all set for them. There's no more personal time. They gave up their food with intense fasting, their bodies, their energy, their whole lives to God. If you see the schedule, it starts at 4 to 6 in the morning with midnight praises. At some point you have liturgy, you have vespers, and that's all communal, like with other monks and nuns. And there's work. So the work that goes on in a monastery is to sustain themselves. They farm, they have gardens, someone works in the kitchen, someone works in the bookstore, all the money. In St. Macarius Monastery, I learned from the monks that they work overtime. I saw them, they worked so much. And they didn't ask us to work at all, which is unusual. And I asked them, why do you work so much, especially the young monks? They said, we work not only to sustain us, but so that we have something to give to the poor. There's lots of poor people around them that they wanted to provide for. And I thought the verse that touched me most and reminded me most about monasticism was Romans 12:1. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Now I read this verse, and I didn't, as I was reviewing, I realized the word reasonable at the end, and I was like, how is that reasonable? We use the word reasonable today to mean, something that makes sense, or something that, that's reasonable, let's do it, why not? St. Paul is saying that presenting your body a living sacrifice is reasonable. And this word in Greek is actually derived from the word logos. It's logical. It's rational. It only makes sense. It's the only thing that makes sense. It makes more sense than everything else. And so St. Paul is stressing, using this word, saying, present your body as a living sacrifice. So the monk's response is not absurd. The nuns who go and live forever for Jesus, it's not crazy. It's not a waste. It's the only logical response one can have. And I was asking myself, asking God, like, how is that a reasonable response? How is that a logical response? Why does it make sense? Like, make it make sense, you know? So I was asking God, and really the verse that touched me was St. Paul saying, the love of Christ compels us. The love of Christ constrains us. It forces us. It forces me to respond. Like, we love Jesus because he first loved us, as St. John taught us. And let me finish the verse here. Because we judge thus that if one died for all, then all died, and he died for all, that those who live should live no longer for themselves, but for him who died to them and rose again. So the love of Jesus compels me no longer to live for myself. I need to live for him. Why? Because he did so much for me. He poured out his blood for me on the cross. He gave me salvation. He gave me eternal life. He became like me so that I can become like him. The only logical response, if that was a human, the only logical response, if someone loves you that much, is to love them back. But this is God himself who owed me nothing, and I owed him everything, including my life. There's the picture in the background here is a story from John chapter 12, when Mary of Bethany anoints the feet of Jesus, and she anoints them with a very, very costly, fragrant oil. And there were people here judging her and saying, like, why this waste? Why this waste? But she thought it was worth it. And so I always ask myself, so is offering myself to God worth it, or is it a waste? Like, is it a waste of time, waste of life? Like, I only get one life here. Like, what's the best way I can spend it? Now, the reason the love of Christ compels Mary to offer to Jesus, it's probably manifold. One of the main reasons is, she cherished and valued Jesus. And as I cherish and value Jesus, I will offer more. Why does she cherish him? Why does she value him? Well, even in the same chapter, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus, who had been dead, whom he raised from the dead. So even the gospel introduces Mary in relation to her brother raised. Jesus raised my brother from the dead. Jesus is giving me eternal life. Jesus transforms my life. What's oil in the face of that? You see, the saints, when they offer to Jesus, they're not calculating what they're offering, and they don't think it's a waste. In fact, very frequently, the saints at the end of life will think, I have not begun to repent. I have not begun to offer to Jesus for what he has done for me. And it's not a poetic expression. As one draws closer to the love of God, they realize that nothing that we can offer is worth it, is worth what Jesus has done for me. She offered to him a costly oil that was approximately worth the salary of a working man for one entire year. And she was a woman with no job, with no chance of getting a job, so this is probably something she inherited from her family and was like her only chance at security in life. And she broke it. Once you break the flask to put oil, you can't undo it. You can't pour some of it, you break it or you keep it. She broke it and poured all of it. And so the disciples said, and the other people around said, why this waste? Why would you waste it? Some of them said, why don't you sell it and give it to the poor? As if if they were in her shoes, that was their logical plan. But seriously, why this waste? And we can sometimes look at monks and nuns and people who fully give themselves to God and say, why this waste? Why do you waste your life? Some of these monks, I met a monk in Egypt. He was an ophthalmologist. He's an eye surgeon. He graduated from that and then went to the desert. Why? Why this waste? But to them, seriously, it's not a waste. This is the only logical, this is the only rational, this is the thing that makes most sense, even more sense than being a successful family man, businessman, whatever it was in the world. St. Pope Carlos VI was told the same thing. Why are you wasting your time in the monastery? You have a career, you have education. That was rare at the time. Now, living as a witness to God, living as a martyr to God, is not a matter of outward expression. So we don't all have to become monks and nuns to be dedicated to God. It's not about wearing black. It's not about spending time in a physical, isolated location. It's actually most of all a matter of the heart. So where is my heart? St. Paul uses an expression in 2 Corinthians when he's trying to encourage them to gather together like a monetary gift donation to give to the poor. He's encouraging them, and he says this phrase called, that when I come, I could see the proof of your love. It's from chapter 8:24 in 2 Corinthians. Proof of your love. Now, do I need to prove anything to God? Do I need to prove anything to anyone? No. But if I love Jesus, are my actions a reflection? Are my actions proof of that? When we love a spouse, have I done anything to prove that to him or her? Of course. How else can they receive it? How else can they see it? So St. Paul also more than once in the epistles uses a phrase called labor of love, because love labors, love works. Love doesn't necessarily have to go to the monastery, but what have I done? What are my actions doing to reflect my love for Jesus? We can look at the talents, the gifts, the privileges that God gave me and think, how can I offer them back to God? The monks and nuns have a specific calling and they're responding. We all have a calling and we're all here to respond. Like we said in the liturgy, we offer to you from what is yours. God gave me something that's His. How can I offer it back to Him? It's the only rational thing I can do. It makes the most sense. It's like a parent who gives a kid allowance money. Christmas time comes around and the kid decides, what? I'm going to spend my money on something for mom. And she gets her mom a gift, and her mom is overjoyed with happiness. But at the end of the day, it's the mom's money now being spent on her. But then that's how God is with us. He gave us allowance money, He gave us talents, He gave us privileges, He gave us gifts, He gave us time, energy, life. And if I give it back to God, it's His anyways. But He's so overjoyed that, wow, the thing I gave him or her, they're not using on themselves selfishly, they're giving it back. There's a beautiful worship song for those who love songs called A Little Longer. And the lyrics are, what can I bring to you? What can I do for you? What kind of song would you like me to sing? I'll pour out my love for you. It's someone who's recklessly in love with God. What can I bring? What can I do? How can I offer something to God? I like that spirit because it's the other way around. We're always thinking, what can God do for me? If I pray, what do I get in return? Imagine if we flipped the script for a bit. How can I offer a little bit more today than I did yesterday? How has the love of God compelled me to offer anything at all? This isn't about monetary offerings. Has the love of God compelled me at all? And if it hasn't, that's okay. There's this beautiful verse, and I think this can be an exercise for us this week on the screen. It's from Song of Solomon. It's a poetic love book. And this verse says, draw me away, we will run after you. So it's people in love with God. It's people in love with Jesus who just want to love Him a bit more, to do something about it, to do something. We all know the good we want to do. It's hard to sometimes put it in motion, but I can ask God to draw me away, to woo me with love. And then I can run. I'm not going to walk, I'm not going to rest, I'm going to run after God. So we can pray this prayer to allow the love of God to deeply penetrate our hearts. If God doesn't help us, it's okay that I decide to love God, but my decision only goes so far. It's the grace of God who will give me. It's the Holy Spirit who will lead me to show God love. And I put a baton here on the screen because we just talked about monasticism, the thousands of monks who live in the deserts until today, the thousands of monks who have come before us, the martyrs who have come before us. Mary of Bethany offered costly oil. The martyrs shed their blood. The monastics gave up their lives completely. The church, historically and modern day, has been drawn away with love and is running with love. And they're coming to us. If you've ever played relay or anything, the handoff is everything. So I used to run track, and we want to win, so we're putting our fastest runner last or whatever. Once we dropped the baton at a track and field meet, and we were the fastest team. By far, we were the fastest team. We came dead last because we dropped the baton. You have no time to pick it up off the floor and hand it over. It's over. And so the church is handing us a baton today. May we take what was handed down and run like the wind. Glory be to God forever. Amen.